Well, I think, judging from the title of this video and this article, I think it really speaks for itself, really. This comes from the Sydney Morning Herald, and the title is Look at the US and the UK and be glad we're not like them. Pandemics don't change us, at least in the short term. They reveal us. We come to them as we've been formed over decades and we respond accordingly. That's all I can think as I've surveyed the carnage unfolding in the US and the UK and contrast it with what we've had so far and achieved in Australia. We might think these societies to be broadly similar, but right now we're witnessing the differences between us and the way in which Australia has so far escaped a certain political and social decay which has proven life-saving. The contrast with America is more obvious, so let's start there. When an anti-lockdown protest erupted this week, demanding that governments reopen the economy, supported by President Trump, even though it contradicts his administration's own health advice, it became clear just how irredeemably fractured American society has become. To see a protester yelling at a nurse who is on the front line of the pandemic, telling them to go back to China, probably tells you enough. But if you want more, look at some of the signs. We deem our government non-essential. Communists kill more than COVID. Rockefeller Medicine and Big Pharma are terrorists. Make America great again. Ban homo marriage. This isn't a mere collection of people wanting more economic activity. They're treating this as a culture war, buying into all manner of conspiracy theories along the way. This is remarkable because shared threats usually create unity and solidarity among human beings. That's why we're so constantly drawn to the analogy between this pandemic and war. It conjures up imaginary of willing sacrifice and massive all hands on decks efforts that is bigger than our differences. So how big must those differences truly be when they are outweighed by the fact that literally thousands of people are dying every day? Many have mocked the catchy that we're all in this together. America shows us what it looks like when we really aren't. It's tempting to explain this as a product of a fatal vein incompetent leader, but there's no doubt that Trump's response to the crisis has been wildly inconsistent, frequently with neglect and hyperpolitical language, but that's about as much as a symptom as the cause. A healthy society with such leaderships punishes that leadership. It doesn't tear itself apart in defense of it. What we're seeing now is the end result of several cancerous decades in American public life. America has long since become a country with no agreed set of facts, no way of its citizens talking among themselves, and no limit to the hypocrisy and corruption it will tolerate on partisan grounds. You see this in the story of the Republican senator who received a briefing explaining just how diabolical COVID-19 could be, then suspiciously sold off millions of dollars worth of stock before the share price crashed, and then finally accused the Democrats of exaggerating the threat. Now she's been appointed to the task force devising ways of reopening America. Now consider Britain, where we've just learned that the already tragic death toll could be 40% higher than we're being told. You could choose so many telling moments here, but mine was when the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, decided to pick a fight with the Premier League footballers, who had been reluctant to take a pay cut, almost certainly to deflect from his own government's failings. Sure, there are valid criticisms to be made of the players, but these are the same players who are donating millions of pounds into a special fund for the NHS, all of which raises a question that might be easily overlooked in Britain, but seems obvious from here. Why the hell is Britain relying on footballers to fund the NHS? And it's an absolute tragedy. And it's not only just footballers having to rely on to fund the NHS. It's the guy, the colonel. I can't remember his name now. An old guy doing laps of his garden. Look, the NHS is not a charity, and we know this because that was one of its founding principles. The NHS is not a charity. It is a government-funded public service that provides you for health needs when you need them. And we have had a decade of austerity and Tory leadership that has just bitten away at that, bit point by point by point. So anyway, we continue from our Australian friend because it's very clear to Australia here what's going on. So at least in part of that answer must be a decade of finding funding cuts in the name of austerity. The idea that the NHS should simply be slimmed down to a safety net looks a pretty stupid one when you start seeing the NHS staff making ventilators out of snorkels. If only Britain was part of the EU's bulk buying purchasing of ventilators, as it's still entitled to be. Unfortunately, it chose not to be for reasons that keep changing. First, because it's, quote, not in the EU. Then, it was because of a communications error. Then, as a political decision, before the last explanation was then retracted. Britain was so vulnerable because of austerity, rather than more equitable taxation, was its answer to the last economic crisis, which has left behind a hollowed out welfare state and inequality that one Nobel Prize winning economist said was following an American path. Australia is a different place, more equal, less economically ravaged, but also less divided by the kind of toxic politics that has beset the US and the UK recently. To be sure, we've had a crack at some of these things. Equality is rising. Our economy is beginning to suffer even before the COVID, and we've given divisive, dysfunctional politics a good go for a decade. But we're nowhere near as far down that path, and right now it's saving us. We'd lost much of our faith in politics, but returned just enough that we've completely remarkably with the restrictions the government has imposed. We're restless yet not reckless in the American fashion, which is why it matters so much what comes next. Already the machines of political context are whirring into action. The Morrison government is setting itself up for an aggressive pro-business plan for our post-pandemic economy. Specifically, that means tax breaks for businesses, even a big swing at industrial regulations. It's the road that leads to lower wages, worse conditions, and limited tax revenue. And some of that might end up being an economic necessity if it's not done perfectly. It's a road of austerity and increasing inequality that has proven so destructive elsewhere. Obviously, all that will depend on the detail, and we should take care of this chance to heed the warning from those nations that are still unraveling. Sacrifice a basic level of equality for economic growth and you risk social and political fracture. There will be much we can't afford after this, but one of them is losing the threads of the social solidarity we still have left, because we need them desperately when the next crisis hits. And I completely agree with this guy. He's got the nose exactly what's wrong with Britain. We've been levelled for the past decade in an economic plan of choice by the Tory government called austerity, and it was a choice, it was always their choice, to basically let's just, lower our tax income and not fund all these social welfare programs, the NHS. And as more people, might be pointing out and blaming the Tories, but I'm sorry, there's only one party that has been in power for over the past decade now. They are the ones who are have been at the helm, And we have seen what their economic policy has been. This is the result. People felt left behind, and then they blamed the EU. Well, the EU had nothing to do with austerity. In fact, the EU actively probably provided more funds and funding and investment to this country than our own government has, certainly for the past decade. So, it certainly wasn't the EU leaving you behind. It was the Tory government.